we have Michael Hillas today that is going to talk about the adoption problem. And well, I probably shouldn't waste any more time. And you should get to it, Michael. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you for having me, Ramina, Yale, Saul. I'm flattered to be given the opportunity. So yes, I will figure out how to share a screen and go from there. Okay. Yeah. So today I'll be talking on the adoption problem, which I think a few of you will have heard about a little already. In particular, I'll be responding to Michael and Gillian's paper on the issue. And as Romina hinted at, I think my biggest issue is that they don't go far enough. If anything, I agree with them more than they agree with themselves. We'll. Yeah.
So it's like, oh, well, this is not gonna be.
Let's get started. So just a quick overview of where we'll be heading. So just for those who don't already know the details, I'll be giving hopefully a fairly brief introduction to the adoption problem. Then under a Quinean perspective, that's going to be just going through Michael and Gillian's account on the issue. And then I just go over what they see as a initial failure on their account and suggest that maybe there is a way to turn it into a success, and then go through a success that they see and suggest that maybe if it's not a failure, then it's on par with the previous success, and then just briefly talk about the lessons we learn along the way and perhaps other things we might want to talk about in the future. Okay, so let's hop into things. So starting with the adoption problem. This is I used a quote environment in LaTeX, which got rid of the emphasis that was added by Devitt and Roberts 2020. So this is actually just verbatim what I believe appears in Ramina's paper on the topic. But so the adoption problem is just a claim that certain basic logical principles cannot be adopted because if the subject already infers in accordance with them, no adoption is needed. And if the subject does not infer in accordance with them, then no adoption is possible. I have had people observe to me that the first part of this is somewhat redundant. The adoption problem can kind of just be articulated as if the subject does not infer in accordance with some rule, they can't adopt that rule. The first bit helps understand exactly how to frame it, but the adoption problem is really about adopting rules, not about already knowing them. Okay, so in order to sort of motivate what the problem is, I'm sure many of you will have seen it, but I know at least a couple of people are not adoption problem experts quite yet. We get this motivating example where we have a very simple case of UI, which I guess is technically UI modus ponens or something like that. So we have a very simple inference. So all the animals in the movie talk. Sorry, it's Madagascar. I guess that's, I left that part out. But so all the animals in the movie Madagascar talk. Alex is an animal in the movie Madagascar. So Alex talks. So from A1 and A2 by universal instantiation. And we're told to imagine a character called Harry who does not yet know how to infer by universal instantiation, and we are trying to convince him to adopt universal instantiation. And so the first step to this is to present universal instantiation as a piece of, well, what we'll come to know as declarative knowledge, but as a proposition, and say, okay, well, believe this. And then we assume that he believes it, but then we see that he will still have some problems in inferring in accordance with it, in that you would think he would have to have some form of inference of the following sort in order to adopt UI. So he'd have to go and say, universal statements imply each of their instances. All the animals in the movie talk is a universal statement. Therefore, all the animals in the movie talk implies each of its instances, which itself looks somewhat like UI in what we're saying is a problematic way. So it is not sort of a definitive reductio, but it serves as an illustration as to what the problem involved is and why there's some reason to be a little bit suspicious of rational adoption of logical principles. So hopefully that's enough just to introduce it. I'm sorry if people aren't aware of the problem and would appreciate a little more talk on this, but I will power through just, in favor of time. Okay, so we're going to be turning to Michael and Jillian's account now and their purported solution. So their idea, so I say I'll mostly be responding to Devitt and Roberts, Michael and Jillian's Quinean account of adoption, which emphasizes sort of the scientific reality of learning skills, essentially. But in doing so, they emphasize several distinctions, the ones which I take to be key being the distinction between the adoption question and the acceptance question, the difference between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge, and the difference between explicit learning and implicit learning. So I don't know how Michael will feel about this claim, but I'm saying that I'm not trying to dispute the details of these distinctions and not sort of trying to argue with the claims I make about the science on these issues and take them to be largely correct about what the science has to say. If I err in how much I'm accepting this, I'm sure Michael will tell me, but I'm doing my best to just take the science as a given and just express the distinctions as they appear in Michael and Jillian's paper. Okay, so starting with this first distinction, the adoption problem is the one we care about, but we need to distinguish this from a separate question, which is the acceptance question. So this is a question of whether a person can rationally accept a new basic logical principle, accepting that inferences should be governed by a new rule, R prime is what we'll call it. So perhaps replacing an old rule of R and how you would go about adopting a new rule in this way. So the adoption problem, the one we're actually interested in, is whether a person on the basis of accepting such a new logical principle can actually rationally change their practices so that they are able to infer by this rule that they have previously accepted. So in the paper, Michael and Jillian do have interesting things to say about how rational acceptance works. I like their account for the most part. I think it works well under the sort of regime that they are selling or advocating for. But I won't sort of go into detail of how acceptance works. If Michael feels that part of their account of acceptance is important to what's going on with adoption in a way that Michael and Jillian can make this distinction between the acceptance question and the adoption question. So the acceptance question is about rationally accepting a new basic logical principle, whereas adoption is sort of rationally changing our practices to be governed by that rule. So, and I think that they have very interesting things to say about the acceptance question, most of which I agree with. I think in the paper on which this is based, I make a few comments but don't really speak that much on it. I won't be speaking at all on the acceptance question in this part. Well, in this talk, I'll be focusing in on the adoption question. And if that makes an error in the argument, then I will listen to whatever Michael has to say. But yes, so the difference between declarative knowledge and procedural knowledge. So this is the difference between sort of propositional knowledge and knowledge of skills or the ability to do skills. So Michael and Jillian draw on the literature and psychology fairly heavily, just sort of taking what they have to say at face value, I guess, as experts. And there, the distinction is between consciously represented knowledge and procedural knowledge is either unrepresented or represented subconsciously. I don't think that, I think they also take it that which of these two is true is not that important to their argument. I certainly won't be taking that to be key to what's going on here. It can be thought of as the parallel distinction to that between acceptance and adoption. So acceptance can be seen as the acquisition of declarative knowledge, while adoption requires the additional acquisition of procedural knowledge based on that declarative knowledge. So we are, that should be talking. We should be taking inference to be a skill. So the practice of inferring is a cognitive skill, indeed the preeminent cognitive skill, so direct quote. And then the final distinction that we're going to be talking about is that between explicit learning and implicit learning. This is probably the one I press on the hardest, and the one that I guess I'll get to exactly what I have to say about it, but I again draw heavily on quotes from Devitt and Roberts 2020. So explicit learning is a top-down process that starts from declarative knowledge. So from declarative knowledge, we derive a set of instructions which we follow, and with practice, what the psychologists call proceduralization occurs, and all these processes become automatic. Exactly how the proceduralization occurs is taken to be a matter of scientific interest, but one that Devitt and Roberts sort of take as being explained by the science, and I do fairly similarly, at least until the end. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have implicit learning, where it's a bottom-up process. We observe, we practice, and just sort of pick the skill up. And the examples they use is riding a bike or throwing a frisbee, which I think that sounds right. I think generally you just hop on a bike and do your best. Okay, and so we get a example. I think in their work they place this slightly differently, but it seems like a good place to have it. So while the definition of explicit learning that Devitt and Roberts give is helpful, when they use it to explain explicit learning, there's some bad grammar there. So when they use it to explain explicit learning when it comes to adoption, they rely heavily on an analogy and a disanalogy with particular cases. So more specifically, it's the case of the Fosbury flop. I don't know how common, I certainly knew what this was. It's the standard method of doing high jump. I don't know if everybody knows the name. It's a sort of, you jump sort of backwards over the bar in a way. I hope that's well known at this point. So again, quoting them, declarative knowledge about the Fosbury flop yields a series of instructions on what to do when you want a high jump. So you approach the bar at your greatest controlled speed, plant your foot at approximately 20 degrees to the bar at takeoff, and so on. And then a person wanting to flop follows these instructions and jumps. And after many repetitions of this behavior, the person acquires the skill. So that's the picture. You have some declarative knowledge that allows you to derive a set of instructions, and then you just repeat the instructions until something happens, which we leave the psychologist to explain, and that allows you to have learned the skill and now use the skill automatically. So there's this, what we're really interested in when we're talking about adoption is this notion of rationality. So we want the acquiring the skill to be rationally connected to the piece of declarative knowledge. So again, quoting them, we earlier defined adoption, so they earlier defined adoption that concerns us as a matter of rationally coming to be governed by an inferential rule R prime on the basis of accepting a new basic logical principle. The accepted logical principle is a piece of declarative knowledge. So if the skill of reasoning by R prime can be acquired in any interesting way on the basis of accepting a logical principle, it must be acquired by explicit learning. So a person has declarative knowledge about R prime and uses this to train to reason by R prime, just as a person uses declarative knowledge about the Fosbury flop to train to flop. So any positive and interesting answer to the adoption question must appeal to explicit learning. I guess I'm in the distinction that I'll be pressing on is the one between explicit learning and implicit learning. Similarly, I will be pressing a little bit on the need for explicit learning as in order to have an interesting, or I guess, interesting answer that includes rationality for the adoption question. I think that I'll get to this a little at the end as well. I think that Michael and Jillian may also be happy to give up or accept that maybe they give up parts of this by the end of their account as well. And maybe we do agree on a lot of this, but at least as you can see from the quote, at least near the beginning, they are claiming that explicit learning is what we should be focused on when we're talking about rational adoption. Well, adoption in the rational sense. I made an error, so I believe we've moved on to the next section. So we're beginning to talk, well, the next subsection, we're beginning to talk about the solutions, or yeah, I guess solutions that Michael and Jillian are saying are solutions to the adoption problem. The first of which spoiler alert, they will say fails, is a self-training solution. So the idea here is that Harry learns to reason by UI in a very similar way as you would take them to learn the Fosbury flaw. So they have a piece of declarative knowledge that they accepted using whatever happens with acceptance. And this yields a set of instructions on what to do when you want information about a certain F entity, for example, about the animal Alex in the movie Madagascar. So the instruction is along the following lines. So take any universal you believe about Fs and infer an instance about that entity. For example, about Alex, Harry believes the universal, so based on some other piece of information, and then follows the instruction, and so infers the instance Alex talks. And so after many repetitions of this sort of behavior, the idea is Harry acquires the skill of UI reasoning. Fairly straightforward picture, fairly just follows from their setup essentially, now that they've made this distinction between acceptance and adoption, and now they've made this idea of explicit learning, explicit, it seems very straightforward. And I guess their view is it's too straightforward. So the claim here is that this first proposed solution to the adoption problem fails, and in particular does so because it relies on a UI-like inference. So this is similar to the initial failure of the adoption problem. So using an analogy to the Fosbury flaw, they claim that the necessary sorts of instructions are conditional instructions. So they are of a general form, if in C, do A, rather than simply do A. So they aren't propositional, these are instructions, these are imperatives. But they are, it appears, analogous to a conditional or a propositional conditional. And the following instruction, and I guess they claim that following such an instruction requires an inference that looks very like UI. And in showing this, they give the following shape of a example. So if you want to find out about a certain entity X, you believe that X has a certain property F, and you believe all entities with that property F have another property G, then infer X is G. So this is sort of like the, well, you can see why it at least sort of looks like this initial argument, I guess, for the adoption problem, sort of against being able to rationally adopt. It's this sort of second level universal about what to do when you come across a universal. So then you want to find out about a certain entity, Alex. You believe that Alex is an animal in the movie, and you believe all animals in the movie talk, and then you should infer that Alex talks. So this is not propositional. This sort of has some imperatives. Infer Alex talks is imperative. But it still very much seems like an argument of sorts. They have a nice discussion about sort of whether, well, I guess essentially in favor of construing this as an argument. And so C1 looks very much like a universal, C2 looks like it is giving particular, and C3 looks as though it took the universal and applied it to some particular. So it's in an imperative form, but it very much looks like an argument and looks like one that's using UI. If you think that this is separate because it's using an imperative, then you're moving the problem from UI to UI star, which then will become unadoptable and looks a whole lot like UI. So it doesn't seem as though it is very much of a solution, all things considered. So that's their account of the failure. So after finding this issue with their initial solution, they offer a second solution, and that is to suggest that Harry should hire a coach. So as we do when we want to learn particular skills, we find someone else who knows better than us and get them up to teach us how to do it. They think the same thing can be done for reasoning skills. So both the learner and the coach would have declarative knowledge of a skill, which yields basic instructions. I guess you would not be able to follow the basic instructions because you don't have the skill, but the coach will follow the basic instructions. And since I do have the skill, they won't have any issue with this. So they would then serve the role that UI star was serving in the failed solution. So you start with Harry's coach having some inference. So all the animals in the movie talk. So Alex is an animal in the movie. And then so Alex talks. The idea is you have the coach presenting Harry with 1 and 2 in some appropriate circumstances where inferences should be happening. And then Harry is told that, I guess Harry believes these already. And then when they want information about Alex, you tell Harry, okay, now infer Alex talks. There's a little bit of exactly what role inference is playing in here is, I guess, not what I wanted to put pressure on, whether or not it sort of makes sense to talk about inference in this way. But let's assume that there's a sense in which you can infer just based on a basic imperative, infer that Alex talks. So that we're taking this as sort of a good solution for the moment. And so that solves the problem. We don't have our way that we can do it by ourselves. We can't just self-train to have a solution. But if we have a friend who can already UI, we can get our friend to help us. We can get our friend to explain UI. Not explain UI to us, but get us to infer in particular situations in a way that allows us, through the magic of skill learning, to eventually UI correctly. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do that's sort of an actual contribution is to just revisit this initial purported failure. And so insofar as this is an objection, it really just strengthens Michael and Gillian's position, at least in my view. So I'm saying that the solution that they say doesn't work can work or does work. So like with the adoption problem, the argument that Michael and Gillian give isn't sort of a true reductio. They give a particular way that you might try to self-train, and it might even be a particularly plausible way that you might self-train to adopt a logic, and the kind of reasoning you might use or might be forced to use if you're going to train in this way, but it doesn't preclude other possibilities that someone might come up with. Sort of another method of reasoning by which one would be able to derive UI in just the sort of way that is required. And that's essentially what I'm claiming to do. So I warn you in advance, it's extremely unintuitive and would be an extremely inefficient way to actually go about doing this. So the sort of, I guess I'd say it was a mistake. I don't think that conditional instructions require the use of UI in the way that they seem to be saying they do. Maybe they have some wider explanation of why they take it to be the case, but at least in the paper, it doesn't seem like they spell this out as much as as much as would be needed to convince me. To me, it seems as though instructions like, if it is raining, take an umbrella, do not immediately strike as requiring UI or a UI-like inference. It seems as though they require modus ponens, and I guess all of this, I probably should have mentioned this at the beginning. modus ponens seems like a different sort of problem. I don't think I could run any of these arguments about that particular inference. That is difficult to deal with. But in such a case as this, it seems like if one believes it is raining, then one should just respond by taking an umbrella. I guess I probably should have put it on this slide. It also requires some sort of bare recognitional capacity, so the ability to recognize when it is raining. But again, I believe that that is something separate from a UI or UI-like inferences. I guess I'll go on to discuss those a little bit further down, but this is probably where I should have introduced that on the slide. Yeah, and so the solution is probably even more simple-minded than the initial solution. So rather than asking the user of the inference to make a particular inference, we just say, make an inference, give it a go. So the first two lines are the same, but instead of saying infer Alex talks, it's just infer some proposition. And I admit, this may initially seem like a very outlandish way of trying to learn anything, so UI included. And so I should probably try to defend it a little. Okay, so there are some very clear-cut reasons to object to this sort of solution where you are just going through the first two steps and then inferring some random proposition. The first would be that it has some UI-like inference. So this is essentially going back to the claim that conditional instructions require some application of UI. So does this argument truly not use a UI-like inference? So if one compares it to the original version of the argument, so where the conclusion is infer Alex talks, it at least doesn't seem to include the suspect step in the argument where Alex is put into the conclusion. Here, nothing is put in the conclusion. You're just asked to do something. And given that you have these non-inferential skills, you should have the ability to do the thing that is asked of you. As such, it at least doesn't seem to have exactly the same problem that the original argument has. So again, in the paper, the claim is that maybe I misread the paper. Maybe if Michael feels I'm misrepresenting him, I'm sure he won't shy away from saying so. But I believe they explicitly say that these conditional instructions require UI, and I'm just sort of saying no, they require some bare recognitional capacity. But all that is required to get from D1 and D2 to D3 is modus ponens, in the same way to get from it's raining to if it's raining, then taking an umbrella, and it's raining is to be able to recognize that it is in fact raining. And I guess I specify you need to be able to recognize that Alex is a thing, and then Alex being in a movie being some entity having some property, and all animals in the movie talking being all entities with property F having another property G. Yeah, so you can sort of put these things in the spots where you expect them to be. Yeah. So I guess this is, I don't think this is probably the objection that people would have. Well, maybe Michael, but I don't know. I think there are bigger fish to fry. So you can bring it up if this wasn't clear, but I think hopefully that's clear enough. Okay, so I think more immediate objection is that this would just never get you to be able to UI. So you'll just be randomly inferring arbitrary propositions when you're presented with random universals, and this is not a method that can allow you to learn UI at any point. The first response is just sort of an argument from ignorance. I'll near the end, I'll sort of flesh out exactly what I have in mind in terms of where this fits in the wider scheme of things, but it's pointing to the fact that this is really a question for science to answer. So how skill learning functions isn't sort of fully understood and is a bit underdefined here. So it's an empirical question that we don't have to answer as to whether or not the method would work. That being said, I do think that the picture lends itself to a Quinean picture overall. So this is sort of a matter of trial and error. The idea is that, well, if UI is empirically supported, these random assortments of inferences that succeed will be the ones that follow UI more often than not. So over time, you'll refine the inferences and you'll tend towards UI, maybe very slowly. So yeah, I guess that I think is the biggest objection. I think I think that there's sort of a very similar argument that you'll get an inference that isn't quite UI. So if you have declarative knowledge of UI in particular, and then get to sort of UI star, which gives you most of what you want from UI, but maybe gives you some extra, gives you a little bit less, maybe that's a problem. So I think when you draw out this distinction between explicit learning and implicit learning, these are the sorts of results you'll get, that you defining exactly what the skill you will learn from declarative knowledge, I don't think is as simple as the initial picture suggests. And so I guess this is to say whatever problem is going on here will likely be the same problem that occurs for other skills. So the next objection is that UI-like a UI-like inference is being used somewhere else. So not where the initial thought not where it was in the initial argument. It's not used between D1 and D2 and D3, but somewhere else in what you have to do in order to be able to learn, there'll be some UI inference. So in particular, a plausible place you might think a UI inference needs to take place is in checking whether or not your UI attempts are successful. So would you need to use UI to check whether or not the use of UI resulted in something that was consistent with the rest of your beliefs? So does recognizing that universal X PX and not PA is inconsistent, does that require use of UI? So again, the first answer, I'm giving the framework, I think this is a reasonable answer, is that this is that there is a psychological version of this question, and that is very much for the psychologists to answer. And they might say, yes, you need UI to be able to do this. But logically, at least, it seems like this is a clearly distinct ability, I guess. The ability to recognize that there are contradictions in your set of beliefs, in particular contradictions between universal XPX and not PA. Well, yeah, not PA. Yeah, seems like a different skill. Well, it is, I guess, technically a different thing. And I guess in particular, I don't say that here, and I think I do say it in the paper. Maybe I shouldn't have skipped over this, that it's something that I think is required for the acceptance step to go through in the way that they want it to. And therefore something that was needed in order to get up to this point at all. Yeah, so I'm willing to discuss this during the questions. Maybe people have a stronger intuition that this is not something that's able to be detached from universal instantiation, but I take it that it can be. Okay, so the last objection, and the one that I think hints is, I guess, the most informative objection, I think, is that this is not explicit learning. So it could be said that it's not explicit learning. It does look like they are instructions, and I think they could plausibly be derived from declarative knowledge, and they could, well, my claim is that they could plausibly eventually get you to UI or something like UI. So if they aren't explicit learning, then it seems as though the criteria for explicit learning needs to be narrowed down a little. And it is likely the case that the categories of explicit and implicit learning are do not cover everything, that there are some medium steps in here that are neither explicit nor implicit. It also, I claim, it seems as though it is a structure of learning that exists elsewhere. So I can juggle, I learned to juggle at some point, and when I was sort of learning to juggle, I sort of came up with instructions and came up with a way of learning to juggle. And one of the initial steps was that I just went about sort of throwing the balls up in the air without actually trying to catch them. And it seems like I could derive this particular step from the initial declarative knowledge, but it wouldn't be instructions that I would use when I was juggling at a later date. These are specifically instructions to use while learning the skill. And it seems as though this is an important part of what skill learning is not just coming up with a set of instructions that tell you how to do the skill, but how to learn the skill. So it seems like there's some middle ground here that is left out of the explicit and implicit learning. Oh, did I miss a slide? I may end up repeating myself because I swear I put a slide in here on this. But the other thing is that it is not completely clear that it not being explicit learning is that much of a problem, because it's at least plausible that whatever is being done here, if it were to work, would be a rational way of getting from the initial declarative knowledge to the procedural knowledge. So if there is a middle ground between explicit learning and implicit learning, it seems as though this is a rational middle ground. If you had the initial declarative knowledge, it seems rational for you to try and learn it in this way, to derive instructions that don't tell you how to do it, but tell you how to learn to do it. So yeah, being in the gap, this middle ground between explicit learning and implicit learning isn't necessarily a problem, given that our end target is rationality. Yeah, so we've looked at the failure, now we turn to the success. And essentially what I'll be doing here is trying to show that this coaching solution has a lot in common with this very weird substitute solution to the initial failure. And therefore the coaching solution, at least to some degree, should succeed or fail on similar grounds. Okay, so we turn back to it and see in what ways it is similar to the above self-training solution. So Michael and Jillian take it that this coaching involves a basic imperative. So you just are told to infer Alex talks, and this is something that you are able to do. You're able to take a basic imperative and respond accordingly. So this could be a sort of cognitively primitive in some way. So based on the psychological evidence, I took a look. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so it may be that a psychologist would have had a much easier time researching this, but it wasn't immediately clear to me that this should be taken to be more basic than the conditional instructions used above. And it also plausibly uses modus ponens. So in reaching the conclusion that if I hear an instruction, then that seems at least modus ponens-like. And it also seems to involve something like bear recognition. So in being able to recognize something as an imperative in the first place, that seems, yeah, if you don't have this bear recognition, then I'm not sure how much you can do. And one of the things I'm not sure you can do is follow imperatives, follow what someone has to say. So given that this is what we asked of the this very basic self-training solution, it likewise would be required for the coaching solution, and it therefore seems to put these two solutions in a similar position, which if you initially thought the coaching solution was plausible, that's not a good thing for the coaching solution. You don't want it to be put in the same position as the self-training solution. So if you don't take this to be the case, then it leaves a charge for Michael and Jillian to answer. So they will sort of have packed a lot into this notion of basic imperatives. And I think some story of how these imperatives could be followed without a modus ponens like inference and bare recognition would be something that they would need to provide or point to where the psychologists provide for how that's done. And that, yeah, if that is a psychological reality, that's a psychological reality. As a philosopher, I'm not going to argue with psychologists on this, but that I think should be included in whatever explanation is given. So I guess one other point of comparison between the coaching solution and the this inefficient self-training solution is that the coaching solution does better. So the Harry, when he's being coached, he doesn't get these bad cases. He doesn't have to sort of work through the cases and slowly inch his way towards universal instantiation. He can just sort of have it every time he infers. He'll get it right. So I don't know. I think there's a question to be asked as to whether or not this is a good thing. So if you think about learning, it seems as though failure is important. So I make some analogy between the Fallsbury flop and inferring. I think it's very colorful. I'm not sure how helpful it is. So the analogy is so in the self-training solution, you might think this is analogous to sort of simply running up to the bar and trying whatever. But what you do have in that case is you have the bar. You have some criteria for failure. You know when you don't get over the bar. You know sort of that you failed. So in the same way, you form some bad beliefs, and if everything else is functioning correctly, you'll recognize them as such, and you'll be sort of learning from your mistakes as you go. So with the coaching solution, the analogy would then be that it would be without the bar, or it would possibly be without even being able to sort of tell how high you've jumped. It's sort of you run in and then just have no memory of the fact afterwards. So you won't be able to recognize where you've gone wrong. So you might augment this training in some way. You might sort of explicitly have the trainer give you some bad cases, sort of explain that they're bad cases. It just does not seem immediately clear that this is sort of enough. On the other hand, I do recognize that this is very much a matter for psychologists to answer, and the philosophy part, probably this is all that can really be said, that there is a question for psychologists to answer here. Yeah. So lessons learned. The first thing I do is just note a passage where Michael and Gillian talk about a very similar point to the one that I'm going to make. So that's so natural skill learning process yields a solution to AP, the adoption problem. It is in principle possible for someone who does not reason by UI to come to do so as a result of accepting the UI principle. But on the other hand, it is, of course, very hard to imagine someone actually doing so. So why is this the case? Well, the problem is that we have to imagine an organism that is sufficiently advanced to grasp the UI principle, something that humans managed only recently, and yet not advanced enough to already be governed by the UI rule. So a fundamental rule of reasoning, and something that our hominid ancestors probably achieved millions of years ago. And that isn't easy to imagine. So perhaps if there were any organism, whether human or not, that had never inferred by UI, it would not be psychologically possible for that organism to adopt the UI rule as a result of accepting the UI principle. So that's the Michael and Gillian position. So I say that this can be strengthened a little bit by considering what is required for these adoption solutions to succeed. So you can note in particular that you need something like modus ponens, and you need something like bare recognition. So you can point to sort of particular inferential, or I guess cognitive structures that are necessary. And the idea that you can have both of these and not have the UI, maybe that really puts pressure on the fact that you would be able to have UI, but be able to not have UI, but the capacity to adopt UI. So in particular, in reference to the two solutions, being impossible according to the psychological literature would be a problem for either solution, so the coaching or self-training solution. And that again is very much for the psychologists to answer. But the similarity between the two solutions in terms of their cognitive needs, I think puts them very much on equal footing. So in terms of being in principle possible, my claim is that this self-training solution is an in principle option with sort of some gerrymandering, maybe not being explicitly learnable, but sort of still rationally adoptable, being what I think is more important. So maybe you could say, oh, they're different in this very particular aspect, that one is explicitly learnable and one isn't. But I think if you default to rational adoption, I think that's more useful. And I think that says, yeah, these are more or less on equal footing. And so I take these two solutions to be similarly positioned. But mainly what I think this says is that it puts more pressure on these particular concepts that are relied on. So in particular, explicit and implicit learning, recognition, and rationality, or whatever rationality is understood as under this Kleinian skill-based account. And I think I had a stronger conclusion in the article, but when I started writing the slides, I decided I'd keep it about here. So there's just more work to be done here in both, I say either, but really in both the psychology and the philosophy, and in spelling out precisely how these terms should be understood, in particular how they rely on related concepts and modes of inference, or whether some of them should be given up wholesale. Yeah, so I think that's my very, very short bibliography. So that's Michael and Julian's paper and Romina's paper. And yeah, all that's left to say is thank you for listening and coming along. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, take it first.
So
You,
right.
Michael Devitt.
Yeah.
If you wanted.
Yeah.
say
Okay.
something
Look,
first.
I thought I won't comment on the criticisms, or at least I will if we go along a bit, because I have some comments on them. But I thought it would be more helpful perhaps to focus on the positive thing and Michael's proposal. Now, I'm a bit puzzled by your proposal, Michael, because I don't see why you don't think it's a self-training proposal. And I don't, Julian and I offered a self-training proposal, and as you of course know, and we rejected it. And I don't see why you think that your proposal isn't open to just the same objections that we gave to our own self-training proposal. Let me just remind everyone about this. The self-training, as we point out, involves certain moves by the person who's training. Something that looks like an argument. You repeated the argument that we gave. It starts off, if you want to find out about a certain entity X, you believe that X has a certain property F, and you believe that all entities with their property F have similar property G, have another property G, then infer X is G. Then you, next premise is you do want blah, 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 blah. So with the example of Alex talks, so you infer Alex talks. Now, we think that this self-training then involves an inference. There it is. And we call it, we don't say it's UI, because it isn't UI, because its conclusion is an imperative, not a proposition. But we say it's UI-like. And then we say, well, look, this is a terrific problem for this solution we're proposing, this self-training solution. We describe the problem like this. We call this UI-like inference UI star. That is the inference that begins with that premise I just gave you a second ago. And we say, one could, in principle, use UI star inference to learn how to infer in accordance with UI. That's the proposal, the self-training proposal. But does this solve the adoption problem? We say no, for this reason. We have simply moved the problem back. For then there would be a problem using UI star, that's the UI-like inference illustrated in this argument I mentioned a minute ago, where you would simply have, be using a UI star to learn to infer by, sorry, there would be we have simply moved the problem back. There would then be a problem with using UI star to learn how to infer by UI star. So the adoption problem would remain. So I don't really see, I mean, you point out quite rightly, and I think actually we need to perhaps drop this phrase UI-like or say a little bit more about it. You point out that the argument I referred to a few minutes ago, which is argument C, which begins off if you want to find out and so on, you point out quite rightly that this is actually modus ponens-like. And it is. But, you know, when we were talking about it being UI-like, we were actually had in mind it was sort of modus ponens-like, but modus ponens is like UI. I mean, you haven't really solved this adoption problem. I mean, Romina's presentation of the adoption problem did involve UI, but she could have used a modus ponens. And so then your point would really seem not to work. That is, instead of the argument she actually gave, you could give an argument which begins with a premise, if anything, instead of saying as Romina did, all the animals in the movie talk, that was her first premise for poor old Harry, she could have started off with this. If anything is an animal in the movie, then it talks. And then the whole issue could be, the whole presentation of the adoption problem could have been using modus ponens, not UI. So nothing really hinges on this at all, it seems to me, Michael. So I don't see how you avoided the objection that we made to our own self-training thing. It's actually simply moved the problem a small difference to another sort of inference. And I think, and let me just add one further thing. If you are going to accept an inference like that, the modus ponens-like one, it puzzles me that you moved away from having a specific conclusion, like infer Alex talks, to infer something. I mean, if the modus ponens is going to work, you might as well give it the final thing, but you might as well give it give you the actual conclusion you want. You want the person to be learning UI, not learning to infer something, but learning to infer, as it were, the right thing. Okay, but that's a small issue. The main thing is I don't see how your self-training avoids the major objection that we made to it.
Okay, so I thought I was going to have one answer, but I think I'm going to have to give a different answer. So I think it's that I had thought that modus ponens is more of a problem than universal instantiation. I was kind of working, like, if you do want to make if you want to rewrite the paper and only talk about modus ponens, I'm very much not sure how you would go about saying you could even do the coaching type solution.
So who's the you here? You mean we?
Yes,
Gillian
sorry.
and me.
Gillian and you, yes, you. I'm not sure whether you could give the coaching type solution and actually have it not use modus. Like I sort of talk a little bit about it, but think it's very difficult to get rid of modus ponens.
Yes,
I was kind of...
But Michael, now you're going back to your criticism of our solution. I was trying to avoid addressing those criticisms. What I'm pointing out is how your self-training solution does not work.
Yeah, no, so
the reasons we gave.
Yeah, so this is only to say that I was only aiming specifically at universal instantiation. So if your defense, or I guess your criticism of my solution is that it uses modus ponens, then, and that means that it is not a solution to whatever the problem was, I can only sort of agree with you, because I had sort of assumed I would be trying to use modus ponens, but not universal instantiation. Maybe it would have been a lot easier to draw out exactly what was going on if the step didn't include both. It's sort of universal modus ponens that is the actual move. And the version of the argument that I give then uses modus ponens, but not universal instantiation. It does not instantiate anything from the the conditional and the antecedent to the consequent. It just says, okay, now try something. So so that is what I was going to, but before the discussion of modus ponens came up, that was essentially what my answer is going to be, that I think it does something, at least, in that you don't need to sort of get the information out of the universal. You just have to recognize that a universal was there. And then you sort of throw everything else into the idea of whatever learning is, essentially. Does that, I don't know whether that helped or whether that made sense.
No, I think I should stop at this point. Well, I mean, I could respond to the criticism, but I think I should let everyone else have a go.
Okay. I don't know if you want to say something. So I
probably do, but you can go first if you want.
Okay. Let me start. I really like the point that you make about when you learn a skill as something different from when you are exercising the skill itself. That, you know, that when you are learning, you might skip some parts. And actually, I'm taking dancing lessons. This is exactly what they ask you to do. Forget about the hands, just the feet, and then, you know, you add, right? But they're like different instructions from what is supposed to end up looking, right? And so I think that's an interesting point. But, you know, as you know, I have problems with Michael and Cillian's solution. So obviously that's gonna transfer to this. One thing that I thought was very interesting is that, you know, these papers went to a journal and there was a referee that made exactly the opposite point that you're making. The claim is, you don't need most ponens, just UI. I'm pretty sure I know who the referee is. But the idea is that, you know, you can have it as an embed, like all the animals in the movie, in parentheses, talk. And you don't need a conditional there. And so that's his point, the referee's point. Yes, he's a male. And
well, why don't you say the idea is it ranges over a domain?
Right, right.
So
which actually had presupposed. But I mean, why is it like that you have a UI universal most ponens? And I think it can't really be avoided, because whatever you say to Harry, he has to apply that to himself as an instruction, you know? So even if you give it to him in this other format, when he goes about in applying it, it will have to be a conditional, you know. And whenever I find a UI, you know, I should infer every instance. This is a universal statement, so I should infer every instance, you know. And so, you know, you may not give it to them as an imperative. You may, or you may give it to them as in this format that the referee proposes, and still, when Harry goes to apply it, you have to make it a conditional. And so that I think that's part of the problem here. Then I got you know, my problem with Michael's and Gillian's solution is that I don't understand at all what is the role that the principle is playing there. And it's crucial that the principle plays a role for it to be a solution to the adoption problem. I mean, I think that if this coach said nothing about the principle itself, it's just said, infer this, infer this, infer this, it should work anyway. So it's irrelevant whether he states the principle or not, because there's no connection between these inferences that he's telling him, I mean, that he's doing for Harry, really, and the principle itself. Now,
Well, do you want an answer to that? Or
you have no answer to that, Michael. No answer to that.
well,
Absolutely none.
I don't even understand, Romina, why since it's explicit, I don't understand why you say it. There's with all explicit learning, there's the same process. You start with the declarative knowledge, in this case, the principle, and then you derive from that instructions, and then you follow the instructions. That's how the learning goes. So the role of the principle is to as a basis for the instructions.
Yes, but he cannot derive anything from the principle because that needs UI. That's why you need a coach. Why do you need a coach for this situation and not for others? Precisely because you cannot do the inferring. Because the inferring is being done for you. And really, you know, in a way, everything comes down to the acceptance questions, because ultimately what I think is that Harry will not understand the statement of the principle if he doesn't UI. You know, that's a concession that is made for the thing to go through. But ultimately, you know, the principle plays no role in your solution because Harry will never understand it. The one doing the understanding, the inferring, and all the work is the coach. You might conditionalize him like a, you know, like a dog into hitting these inferences, but he won't be inferring from the principle because the coach is the one doing that.
Romina, the assumption of your case is that he doesn't UI. There's no assumption in your case that he doesn't understand English.
No, he doesn't understand UI.
So if he understands English, he understands the instructions, and he understands the.
Look, I mean, this is the claim. Even if he understood it, even if he could accept the principle, just by incorporating it into his body of beliefs, that wouldn't be enough. But really, is it plausible to think that he understands the principle?
Of course, no one thinks it's enough. You've then got to train.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously, I accept that someone can get UI by training. That's not the question. The question is whether you can get to UI from a statement of the principle. And I don't think your solution does that, because it's being done for you precisely because you can't do it from the principle itself. And so, I mean, I think that if the coach did exactly the same thing and never bothered to state the principle, you will get exactly the same result. Because the connection is being done by the coach, who is the only one that UIs. You see what I mean? And so you're building the bridge with the coach, but that doesn't mean that that transfers to Harry. You know,
Well, obviously,
I think the same solution would be that the attempt of the solution would be the same even in the archives. So that's my basic problem. But let me say something about Mike. I'm sorry, I'm not having a very good day today. But let me say something about Michael's solution. I have
Michael Hillas.
yes. So there is some, I mean, you talk about bear recognition, but is it really just bear recognition? Because you need to see that individual as an instance of the universal. Otherwise, you won't relate them. It's not recognize it just as recognizing, I recognize you, but recognizing us falling under, you know? And so I mean, that's why I think that the UI is involved. You see what I mean?
So I can see why you would think that, and I'm not sure I necessarily disagree that these things can be detached sort of psychologically. I do, well, I guess psychologically in reality. I think conceptually you can make a distinction between, so when I say bear recognition, I do mean bear recognition as falling within some category. I just think that, like, when you set up the initial so I guess a lot of this has to do with the fact that like I was trying to take a minimal number of things and then not have UI. So I was trying to have everything that you could have without having UI. And I think that being able to say, to like see things in the world and recognizing them as fitting within certain categories seems different from the inferential skill of being able to take something, having some different piece of knowledge that fits within some category, and then inferring that it is sort of all category, another category. So recognizing it as a B and then inferring that it is a C or something like that. Or recognizing that, I guess it's a thing and then inferring that it has some property.
Yeah. I actually have a footnote about this because I'm not even sure that one could speak a language without being able to. So, you see what I mean?
No, that I'm very.
Would you be able to see that a lion is an animal? You know, would that you see what I mean?
Do you remember what the footnote is?
It's early on, probably when I introduced the problem. Yeah.
I'll look it up later.
But I take that to be sort of a problem for the other side because, then it will be more obvious that stating it would do nothing for you.
Is that not just sort of a problem for every side? If all these things just kind of collapse on each other?
It might be a problem. So I take it as a reduction of the argument. So it might be a problem in a way that, you know, people have said to Saul whether you can even state the problem in the Wittgenstein book, you know, because, you know, you need to have a shared language too. Yes. But, you know, the way I saw it was something like, well, let's say it goes through, you know, even if it did, which I'm not sure it does, I suspect it may not, you know. And that's why I'm saying also that he doesn't understand the things of the principle. Of course, you know, if he can't even understand something as Alex is a lion is an animal, or things like that, you know. But yeah, the idea was to the objection could be, you know, how do you state the problem? But my idea was, well, let's concede that can be stated. Even if it did, then this is the result. That's what I was supposed to. But look, I mean, coming back to your idea, I mean, about UI and, you know, being able to recognize something like as having some property not being the same as UI. I don't think the example of raining is really parallel to the examples that we were considering, because you have a universal statement. And so that makes it look more plausible for you, but it's not really the same kind of case.
Right. So that was somewhat. So all I was trying to show there is that conditional instructions don't necessarily have to involve universal instantiation. So I don't know how seriously Michael and Jillian were taking this claim, but they at least mentioned this claim. It may have been that I read it as being a universal claim about conditional instructions, whereas they meant it very specifically within the context of their argument in the self-training solution that conditional instruction required universal instantiation. But all that example is trying to show is that
we don't
claim that. Sorry?
We definitely don't say that.
Say
we
what?
never say it's universal instantiation.
I mean,
Well,
I think I directly.
well, I like, yeah, because of the imperative. But actually,
Yeah,
you
sorry,
know,
Mike.
yeah, that's actually also supposed to be a concession, because it's supposed to be clear and easier for Harry to have an imperative than to have something like a
statement or schema or something.
Yes, a schema, or like you may infer, something like that, because then they can see, then I would be wondering whether he actually is withholding or he's not doing it because he didn't get it, you know? So the idea is that an imperative, it would be simpler. And if he doesn't do it in that case, he's not going to do it in the others either. And that was the idea of why an imperative was okay at that point. Obviously, you don't want to infer every instance of every universal instantiation, because you will be worse off, right?
Yeah.
Than not inferring at all. Okay, so those are mainly my comments. And another thing that I really like of the paper is when you say that making the connection of what skill you will end up acquiring from the declarative knowledge is not as simple, which is connected to the other one that because the other point that I thought was interesting. Because yeah, of course, we don't really know what will happen in those cases, or what will he end up picking up if he does pick up everything, which I don't think so. I don't know, Saul, you want to add something?
Well, okay, let me just mention, well, two things. One is what I really originally set myself up against, right? And
the bad one is,
yeah, look, I know,
like
Michael and Jillian call this a Quinean solution, but actually, look, there's really three views of Quine on the philosophy of logic. One is the one at the end of truth by convention.
One is two dogmas.
One is what people of two dogmas and what people have gotten out of it. And the third is when he started
change of logic,
change of subject, on the basis probably of the stuff on translating languages in word and object.
None is this one.
Yeah, none is this. Now, I was addressing myself to the middle one, which I think is actually refuted by the first one, that is the Lewis Carroll argument. Look, Michael Hillas, I was just wondering, your view is that modus ponens is a more difficult problem?
That would be my view, yeah.
Yes.
I don't.
Yeah. The argument is supposed to be exemplified with this. I have a theory of why Saul picked UI, and I think it's because Wittgenstein, this was supposed to be a course on Wittgenstein, who was reading the remarks, and Wittgenstein talks about UI in the first part, but it could have been something. It could have been modus ponens.
It could have been modus ponens, and that is Lewis Carroll's thing. Romena's title is what Carroll said to Kripke. Anyway, look, first, I just want to say that I don't think that Michael, Devitt, and Julian's paper, nor Hillas's thing, is really a confirmation of Quine of two dogmas as people really enthusiastically accepted it, which was supposed to be that logical laws are like any other scientific hypotheses, and we use them to test things against experience, right? And we're probably conservative, so we usually don't want to abandon logical laws in these tests.
No talk of skills.
Yeah, no talk of skills or anything like that. So that is the first thing, but this is pretty important because Quine's original two dogmas view that affected many people as the truth has really not been confirmed, but rather replaced. Right? Okay, now here is a second thing which is different and is addressed to both Michaels. I'm not actually sure what an inference coach would be or what we are learning to do. I mean, you're learning when you're given a premise A, believe B, or believe that B follows from A. But what is that? Believe that B follows from A. It seems
Accept or whatever, yeah.
Yeah, or
That
accept.
doesn't seem to be an inference.
Yeah, I mean, that is, if it's just that a conditioning, right, that whenever you have A, say B too, or something like that, or at least say B if B is up for consideration. Obviously, UI can't really be in for every instance, it's Romina remarks. Right? So, yeah, so I'm not even sure what this skill is supposed to be on
You
this
won't
model.
understand that it follows. You
Yeah.
won't understand that it follows.
Yeah, what do you
And so that's not an inference.
Yeah, I mean, if it's just a behavioristic thing, when A happens, say B, when you see A, say B or something.
You will be drilled into making it follow.
He will be drilled into talking as if it follows, but he won't be really making an inference. And
someone compare, I mean, in a talk someone else gave in Argentina, someone compared this, like when you're teaching students like math, right, whatever, and then first they kind of follow a recipe, right? But hopefully all of them or most of them at some point may have an aha moment. And that is missing here. You are like training them to do it. And because in the beginning, you maybe you don't expect them to really understand what's going on, but at some point, with the repetition of that, but not because it follows from the principle, but because, you know, they start getting in the process and eventually they see where all this comes from. They may always do it as a recipe in past exams and everything, but you won't think that they really understand what they are doing. Until they reach that aha moment.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of skill training seems to be a purely, well, talking about psychologists, a purely behavioristic thing, or maybe something that's not external behavior, but even is internal mental behavior, believe or accept. That's right. But what isn't really being trained to infer.
Yes. The idea, look, it's not behaviorist at all. It's simply, it's no more behaviorist than the account of any skill. And the idea is, and we're quite explicit about this in footnote 20.
Okay.
We are assuming that because there's no reason why we can't assume this, that Harry already infers. It's just he doesn't infer by UI, or for that matter, modus ponens. It doesn't matter which one. He already infers. If he doesn't infer at all, well.
Oh no, of course, no.
Yeah, that would no sense. So we're assuming
we're taking one by one.
We're assuming that he infers, and we're assuming he understands the instruction. So he understands what inferring is, in the sense that he knows what it is to infer, because he's done it before. And so all we are supposing here, and we have no theory of what's involved in inference, and no one does. This is something we simply don't know enough about. So we're assuming that people infer and that Harry understands inferring, and then he is being taught to infer in a new way. That's what's happening here. So he's not just coming in it's not just a behavioristic idea that he's given a certain stimulus and then comes up with a certain response. It's that he's doing it via a cognitive mechanism of inferring, because that's what he's being trained to do. I mean, let me use the Fosbury flop thing. The instructions to teach someone to Fosbury flop will require that they understand what it is to jump, right? And we assume that the person jumps already and understands what it is to jump, and what he's now being taught is how to jump in a new way, and that's the analogy with the inference.
Well, that's clarificatory. It helps. But how can you train someone to infer this?
Right.
Let's see, really.
I mean, even if he knew what inferring is, and he does, let's assume he does, he won't know why it follows in that case.
Yeah.
And why that is also an inference, because he's not seeing the connection. And that's why the coach is doing the connection for him. And, you know, in the case of the Fosbury flop, maybe you won't need a coach. You have like a very explicit set of instructions, and you'll figure it out with a lot of practice, let's assume. But here, it would be in principle impossible.
Well, we accepted that. That's why we abandoned the self-training.
Well, yeah, but why? It's because
we say
different, but because
we say what we have abandoned the self-training, and Michael should abandon his self-training, because it involves an inference of just the sort that you're supposed to not be able to use. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, but that's that marks the difference between these cases of a philosophy flop and.
But Romina, that is of course the point, and that's what's acknowledged. So it's not in question. There is a difference.
I know that it's not in question, but I don't know if you have drawn all the lessons from why you need a coach in this place. And my take on that is, well, you need it because you need someone doing the inferring for you, because you will not infer. And you won't infer even after the coach does it for you, because he's doing it, not you. And it's as if someone is jumping for you. Then do you philosophy flop? No, you watch. And here it's the same. I mean, that he repeats that, even if you can get him to repeat in the right instances what the conclusion is supposed to be, that would mean that he infers.
So can I sum up what seems to me to be going on here? What seems to me to be going on is an over-intellectualizing of these processes, that you don't really infer unless you have some self-consciousness of what you're doing here, some self-consciousness of logic and so on. Overstating it. You don't really infer until you've got some theory of what you're up to.
No, not at all. Because in the end, I'm with you. You need the skill to get to infer. In the end, I'm with you. Remember that this is a reduction. What I'm criticizing is exactly the views that have these theories that you have some kind of principle in your head, and implicit, explicit, or whatever, and that's what gets you to infer something sort of propositional that you represent and so on.
That's
what I criticize. So in the end, because the argument works, that's the view that falls, right? And you end up in a view, well, whatever, but something like skills would be possible, okay? What won't be needed is the principle itself as doing the heavy lifting, because that's what's shown not to work, you know? So in a way, you know, accusing me of being a theorist, that's not at all right, because that's the view I'm criticizing. In a way, you are more a theorist than me, because you accept this top down. And I would argue that no, that probably will have to be bottom up, and that the top is really doing work after the facts, after the practice is in place, after the facts. And so I'm to the left of you, Michael, unfortunately. Yes, I am. Yes, I mean, like, the view that falls is a view that presupposes that you have something like principle-like in your head being represented and applied.
And that's what the coin of two dogmas.
Yes, in an explicit way. Yeah,
gave people to believe, right? The opposite, rather than being Quinian.
Why do you think I talk so much about Wittgenstein in the dissertation? Because that's the way I was going, you know. Not that I like it, but I've been pushed into that, precisely because this other view doesn't work. So in a way, I think that the skills may well, like, training obviously works, but not because a principle is being stated, because of the practice itself being on display. And if they don't get it from that, they're not going to get it from anything. Not from the principle, not from any statement that you can give them, not if you could plug the principle into their heads. And it's just the practice itself and the repetition of that. And if they don't get it from being involved in that, well, that's too bad. But I don't think this other way is going to work. You still want want the principal to be doing some work. And what I'm saying is, well, you know, it might do work when you already have the practice in place, and it might be, you know, important to perfect the practice, clarify it or whatever, but it's not gonna put it in place.
The trouble with what you're saying is, most of it seems to me to be sort of true, but it applies to all explicit learning. That is, let's take implicit learning, which is probably most learning. It's really a matter of just sort of observing and imitating and just picking it up, throwing a frisbee, riding a bike. You just do it. You practice and you work it out. And there's no role in that for any declarative knowledge or any theory or so on and so forth. However, there is also explicit learning, where the idea is you start from declarative knowledge, and as I said earlier, from this you get instructions and then you follow the instructions. However, the theory of explicit learning, it's nearly all done in just the same way as implicit learning. Nearly all the actual learning is the practice and all that. All the declarative knowledge does, and anyone who's picked up any skill like bicycle riding, throwing frisbees, hitting a baseball, anyone who's done any of those will be only too aware of this, that nearly all the learning comes in actually just doing exactly what you do when you learn things implicitly. So the declarative knowledge does not play much of a role in learning any skill. So it's not really news to know it doesn't play much of a role in learning how to infer.
Well, it is news because most people won't take it to be just a skill, as you do. But that on one side, and on the other side is,
but they're wrong.
The logical, okay, whatever, but they are the majority, and
it doesn't make them right.
No, I know, I know, but you shouldn't be so against me because I'm in a way closer to you than most. But also, you're comparing things that are not the same, because the bicycle, the philosophy flop, all that, you know, doesn't presuppose the thing itself that's being stated, you know. There's something very special about these basic principles, that to perform inferences from them to infer, you have to use them themselves, you know. And that is what makes it in principle impossible that they are going to get it from that. And I don't think in these other cases it's in principle impossible. Maybe someone will learn. I mean, like maybe, you know, we disappear, there's global warming, whatever, and there are bikes around 1,000 years from now. Here come the Martians and figure out from a set of instructions how we use bikes. You know, they're not going to learn to UI from a statement of the principle if they don't do it. And that, to me, marks a very important difference between the two cases. And, you know.
Now, what you say in your own paper is, of course, right, that our ancestors, before any principles were formulated.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Inferred.
I had no problem with that, yeah.
Yeah, inferred according to UI.
One might hope that formulating them helps the practice too a bit, like teaching people logic. Yeah. I don't know if it really does, but that's the hope.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean, I mean, the people that you teach logic to obviously infer, you know, and that's not the situation when you teach someone to ride a bike. They don't ride a bike, otherwise you won't be doing that. And yeah. I don't know, maybe some people have some other questions, because when we get into this, we can't get out. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, is there anyone with questions?
Well, nobody is raising their.
Manuel, Julian had a question. Yeah.
Thanks. Hello, thanks for the invitation. I am a student finishing my degree in philosophy, but I also have years of teaching some logic to the other young people who are preparing for the knowledge tests that the state does. And one of the things that always happens is that not many understand how modus ponens works, and that has led me to investigate a bit. And among others, I found a 1968 text by Watson in which he criticizes Piaget's theory in which an individual has a formal operational thought. For example, for a long time, I have thought, like Wittgenstein, that following a rule is a habit, but some cases make me think that not everyone can understand how the basic logical rules properly work. They can repeat some cases, but they are asked, but when they are asked to create a new one, it is difficult. And I thought that if I have more time, perhaps by repetition, those who have not been able to all achieve it, but time is limited. My question is that a failure to accept a rule, is a failure to accept a rule or a failure to adopt it? That's my question.
Confused. What is it he finds with humans? They don't get
multipliers.
Like they don't see that if you have P.
They don't understand properly how modus ponens works.
They don't understand something even more basic. That is not so. I mean,
we should give it to Michael first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Michael.
I mean, this seems like something a lot of people would be able to answer. I would generally take it that if people aren't able to infer by modus ponens, it's fairly difficult to teach them anything. It's sort of the basic structure is such that sort of if you have A, then you have B. If you're going to teach them anything, then I'm not quite sure, like, if they weren't able to do this, what possible instruction could you give that they could follow? If it was in a form that said sort of, if do this, then do that, then it would be modus ponens and they would have to follow modus ponens. So I tend to think that it would have to be that they're failing some acceptance criteria, that it is that they aren't understanding it because it's in a very particular formal form or something along those lines. That it would be a question of acceptance rather than adoption. But I don't know, other people might have different views.
It's just like people have trouble seeing the logical form as something separate from the content. So when you put something that, you know, the antecedent and the consequent are completely irrelevant, they're like, no, you know, no, this is weird. I don't know what you're doing, you know. And and also grasping the concept of validity is not something that comes very natural to people when you start teaching logic. It takes time. So Saul can't believe that that's true because he never taught Logic 101. But that is true. It takes, you know, you need to start thinking in terms of the form. And that takes a bit of practice and thinking. And so, you know, it's not so easy to understand. I mean, and in actual empirical studies, you can see that people are very biased to content, you know.
In fact, the problem is when they don't they can create a new problem. They just repeat. They can repeat, but when they ask it to create a new one, they don't do it. So that is the problem for me.
I see. So what was the question exactly? Whether they're following a rule, or what was the problem in that case?
I'm agree is an acceptance problem, no adoption problem. Is that I think that Michael Hillas said, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because I think it actually is a skill of sorts. It's just a different sort, like coming up with your own examples in a logic, like what you have to do when you're teaching, sort of coming up with examples for people to see and to sort of go through themselves. That is a skill that you sort of pick up when you teach for a while, and you're sort of expecting the students to do something similar, but it's a very different sort of skill. And I think in how it relates to logic itself, it's at the level of sort of the theory of logic rather than the practice of logic. You're understanding the theory and then sort of coming up with a new skill based on how that theory fits together would be how I would interpret it. It's interesting though. I mean, yeah.
So sort of going the reverse way. You have the theory and then you come up with examples. Yeah.
That's a good idea. Thank you, and thanks for the invitations again.
Anyone else has a question?
We have just a couple more minutes, but if somebody wants to ask something, they should.
Okay. Why don't we just thank the...
Well, wait. Let's see. Do you want to say something else? Michael wants to say something else. Yeah.
I mean, I think that the discussion that Michael, well, the other Michael and Romina were having was interesting, and I think I might disagree with both of you. I think that, well, I was thinking that the part that I was surprised that Michael was not sort of picking up on and I guess running with a little harder was that when you're talking about so I guess because the explicit skill learning is very like the implicit skill learning in a lot of ways. When you are asking some explanation of how adoption is occurring from some declarative knowledge, it's a quite bare relationship, but that's because it's quite a bare relationship in all cases. So Michael was very much making the point that this is a problem for all explicit skill learning, that it is mostly implicit. But I think exactly where that sort of issue is, it's at this issue that when you talk about how you sort of work this skill, how you start training it, it's almost, I mean, I wouldn't want to put words in your mouth, Michael, but the way I got to by the end of the paper, and I guess the reason why I thought maybe you should sort of accept that other people are using rationality in a way that is over-intellectualized, this relationship is very, very bare, and it almost works as just inspiration. It's, oh, I was inspired by the declarative knowledge to pursue the task of finding procedural knowledge. Yeah, so I guess that's sort of the position I'm ending up. I mean, I guess all of this is also sort of a conditional acceptance. I'm trying to understand psychology a little better, but it's kind of hard. So I'm not quite sure what the psychology is saying about it, but yeah.
I mean, look, I mean, just to be very brief, that's all you can hope for here with skill learning. So, I mean, it's not, I'm sort of repeating myself, what I said to Romina, it's not really, you're not raising, I mean, let me repeat, I do accept there's something special about this problem. Otherwise, we wouldn't have to have coach training and so on. But still, the sort of what is being proposed here for so-called rational learning gives a role to the declarative knowledge, just the same role it gets in all explicit learning. And this is not a big role. I mean, if you learn to drive a stick shift car from being told the instructions, well, that's the explicit learning, but we all know that most of it is involved, again, most of the learning is involved in actually trying to do it and doing it and trying and doing it and doing, same Frisbee, same bicycle riding, and same learning a new inference.
Yes, but here the problem is that in principle, no, it doesn't matter how it acts, that in the other cases it actually happens mostly the other way, you know. Here the problem is that in principle it would be impossible. And the fact that we actually do not learn to ride a bike from a set of instructions is not relevant, because maybe we could. I'm not saying that we are not saying that that's in principle impossible. In this case, we are. And yeah, well, that I guess that's the main point of difference between us, how we take that, the weight that we give to that. And I think we give more weight to it than Michael, Jillian, and you, Michael. But yeah, I guess that's one of the main points of disagreement.
Well, I guess that's a good place to end.
You didn't say anything, Graham, and I know that you disagree with everything we said. I see you laughing behind that hand.
Yeah. Okay, well.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, look, let's not start another thing.